皆さんこんばんは。同時通訳を聞くには、Zoom 画面。
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To hear the simultaneous interpretation, please select an audio channel by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. This program is organized by ISIC Japan and produced by Bloom Pacific and Versatech. Sponsors in alphabetical order are BAE Systems, L3 Harris Technologies, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon Technologies. Interpreters are Christopher Field and Paul Hersey. I would now like to turn the floor over to Keio University Graduate School of System Design and Management Professor and former Abe Foreign Policy Advisor, Dr. Taniguchi Tomohiko, to moderate this defense industry forum on the topic of export control in global defense, measures to promote and protect. Thank you. As you just heard, this webinar is provided with two very experienced simultaneous interpreters, Mr. Paul Hersey and Christopher Field. So you may listen and participate in either language without any limitation. As in the topic, we are talking about promotion and protection. These are very important subjects. Promotion, on the promotion side, this is a large legacy from the Abe administration. Starting 10 years ago, this is a word that's a euphemism used only in Japan. We call it defense items or defense goods. To promote these was something that no one could think of. There was no thought of this. During the Abe administration, this became possible to do. And although I say this, you all know that there has been very little actual track record of doing so. We're going to talk about future issues here at this webinar. I would like to do that. And so for that purpose, we've assembled three individuals who could not be better for this purpose. They have very detailed I have very detailed history of my own career on my website. Kasugahara-san has been a very important role, as has Ida-san with respect to military goods in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. These two individuals, Mr. Ida and Mr. Kasugahara, are very important in the Japanese presentation. Both of them have a very rich experience in interactions between government and industry. And it is from that standpoint as well that we hope to have them participate. Today, we're going to first hear from the Ministry of Defense, Kasugahara. We will then hear from Mr. Andrew Radcliffe, and finally from Mr. Ida-san, who will close the day for us, I believe. We are open to, and we have the function for Q&A at any time. You are free to submit your questions at any time, and we hope that you will. I will then try to consolidate the Q&As, the questions that come in, and we will address those afterwards. So at this point, I would like to turn to Mr. Kasugahara's presentation. Thank you.
I am Kasugahara from ATLA. My heartfelt thanks for your invitation to this very important webinar. I have only been in ATLA since July the 1st, and so I'm still studying the lay of the land in ATLA. Prior to that, I was in the manufacturing bureau of METI. I've been to such places as Indonesia in the course of my career. I worked abroad, and would very much like to use this experience and also cooperation with all of you in our work at ATLA. I'll be talking about ATLA's outlook, and Professor Taniguchi mentioned that we've just started, but I'll tell you what we've done so far, the issues that have come up, and new efforts that we're engaging in. Next slide, please. As you all know, Japan's Ministry of Defense and the self-defense forces, starting in the 1990s, began various kinds of diversification and deepening of defense cooperation with various countries. In our constitution, we have the ideal of a peace country that is enshrined, but within that, we contribute to the stability of our region. Particularly in 2014, new 3 principles on transfers, defense equipment, and technology were adopted. And therefore, defense exchanges have added this defense equipment transfer as a new tool. Capacity building is also important. Dialogue is also important, but within this context, we are pursuing defense equipment transfer as well. I'm sorry, this is a busy slide. It may be difficult to read, but the point here is that defense equipment transfer is part of our broader efforts at security cooperation. Next slide, please. Japan receives various requests for defense cooperation, and the needs for defense equipment cooperation vary from region to region. Based on the characteristics of each region, and also based on the wishes of domestic industry, we participate in various defense technology exhibitions. In Southeast Asia, maritime, water-related exhibitions were typical. As to equipment transfer from Japan, from the perspective of the 3 principles, it must be ensured that there be appropriate control. And it's necessary to oblige the government of the recipient country to get prior consent on extra purpose use and transfer to third parties. We have various bilateral agreements, beginning with the United States in 2006, 6 developed countries, 4 developing countries, for a total of 10 bilateral agreements. In March of this year, the most recent bilateral agreement was with Indonesia. And we are in the final stages of negotiations with Vietnam and have already reached a substantive agreement. And moving on to page 5, please. I'm sorry, this is also a very busy slide. So if you're interested in the details, I suggest perhaps reading the slide later. But it shows specific examples of defense equipment cooperation that ATLA is engaged in. The size of each circle represents the scale of each. So yellow shows R&D, Green is parts and components transfer. The blue circles represent transfer of actual equipment. And we have joint development, and also manufacturing. It's basically with developed countries, 25 cases with the United States, which is the greatest number. We have joint research going on with these countries. With the United States, we also have a lot of parts transfers. As to finished products, last August, we had our alert and surveillance radar to the Philippines, which was our first finished item. Next slide, please. Page 6. Also a very busy slide. So we did provide a finished item to the Philippines, a radar. This shows the various efforts that led up to that. So that's the impression you should have of this slide. It wasn't just a matter of sending them equipment. We had training, equipment, maintenance support. So this is only part of much broader cooperation. And it is thanks to all of that that we reached this important milestone of transferring a finished item. Next slide, please. This is the main point of today's webinar, I think. We are engaged in various efforts, but we only have one case so far of transfer of a finished item. Not much experience. So this slide shows the issues that we have to tackle for the future. There are a lot written here. They are mutually related, perhaps. But I have written 6 challenges here. The first is that we have a lack of experience in sales. JMOD has had long-term relationships with the defense industry, but we have not had chances to engage in new sales up to now. The second issue, public-private cooperation is necessary for sales, but I think that we're not there yet in terms of ironing out the issues for public-private cooperation. We have to have communication with militaries, and to make that happen well, the government and the private sector have to cooperate well. The third issue, we have been passive up to now and waited for something to happen, but we have to be more proactive and to seek out potential needs, to look at our partners and to consider their security needs. And from a high level, we should be pushing more to reach out more to meet our partners' security needs. The fourth issue is a framework for information sharing. It also includes information security between the Japanese government and our industry. The fifth issue is an important one. Up to now, low quantity, high variety has been the way that industry has done business with JMOD. We will have to think about keeping costs down in order to participate in international markets. Number 6 is intellectual property. What are we transferring? How are we protecting it? We are thinking about these kinds of issues as well. All 6 of these issues deserve our attention. Next slide, please. While keeping these issues in mind, we have to strengthen our industrial base and also pursue individual cases. There are a lot of suggestions on this slide, but we shouldn't just focus on large cooperation projects. I think we can also pursue smaller projects. And we have to think about legal frameworks and agreements and promoting dialogue. Could we move a bit more in the slides? Next. So in terms of promoting dialogue, starting in 2017, the government with industry has been holding bilateral defense industry forums in various countries like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Australia, Italy, the Philippines. We have been doing this, but unfortunately last year in 2020 and this year, because of COVID-19, we have not been able to hold these defense industry forums. These are important occasions for communication. Therefore, we want to resume them quickly once the COVID-19 situation permits. Next slide, please. This is a new effort that began last year to try to understand the needs of our partners. Feasibility studies are being done in cooperation with trading companies. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. We are exploring various potentials, including looking at the possible costs. Next slide, please. In order to promote information sharing between companies, we have created a site for this and webinars in order to try to promote understanding of practices. Indonesia, India, Malaysia have been places where we have done this, including participation in shows. Next slide, please. International defense equipment exhibitions, we participated in 4 of them in 2019. We planned 6 events in 2020. Unfortunately, the coronavirus prevented our participation. So it's small in scope, but we have showed our defense equipment as the occasion presents itself to attachés and others who are present in Japan. I've tried to give you an overview of what Atlas is trying to do to promote defense equipment transfer. We will try to work on the issues that I've identified in this presentation. And I'm so happy to have this chance to communicate with you all and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
That was Kasugahara's presentation. I would now like, we talked about the Philippine radar incident. negotiation, and communication sharing requirements also came up. Lack of experience on Japan's part in terms of selling weapons to foreign countries. We don't have the experience. And then government private cooperation, we're also short on experience or actual track record. I think he pointed those out very clearly. We now would, having heard this, like to shift our focus to English, and we would ask Mr. Andrew Radcliffe for his presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you that are participating in this webinar. I assume all the issues have now been overcome and you're all getting the sort of engagement that you anticipated. Could we put up the slides, please, as well? Thank you very much. I boldly said in the title of my presentation that I was going to provide a practical perspective from the United Kingdom. I guess I ought to provide a little bit of context for that and to explain how I became involved in export controls in the first place. I can guarantee that export controls was not a career choice from my perspective. I found myself in the British Embassy in Washington in 2005, and there was at that time a very significant export deal being made between the UK government and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That deal was associated with the Typhoon aircraft, the fighter aircraft, and the Hawk aircraft as well. Both of those capabilities have equipment and other features that owe themselves to their origins in the United States. So it was necessary for us to embark on quite a long series of meetings with the US government, various departments, to be able to provide the level of assurances and guarantees that were necessary to enable that sale to take place. And as you might appreciate, it was a multi-billion-pound sale, so it was actually incredibly important that it did proceed from a UK government perspective. And I learned a lot from that experience. And some of those lessons that I learned, I'd like to share with you today. Having left the British Embassy in Washington in 2009, I then joined BAE Systems as an international government relations individual, working specifically, as you might imagine, from a US perspective. So I was immediately posted back to Washington by BAE Systems, and I had the opportunity there to work on another deal associated with Typhoon, this time a company-related deal, which was related to the Kingdom of Kuwait. In addition, I spent quite a lot of time working on another agreement, which was the UK-US Defence Trade Cooperation Treaty that was actually signed by President Bush and Prime Minister Blair in 2007 and was ratified in 2013. So I hope that explains a little bit about my background and gives you enough confidence that I do have some fairly direct hands-on experience of dealing with export controls, not just with the United States, but also with other allies as well. Could we go to the next slide, please? From a UK perspective, the UK has a long history of both being an exporter and also a partner in defense and security equipment and capabilities. I've inserted two slides there. The one bottom left, chart 1, indicates that we have a fairly robust track record of being number 2 or number 3 in terms of world's exporters of defense and security capabilities. The slide at the bottom is just defense-related business. And the slide on the right indicates that we have decades of experience of being a responsible international defense and security partner in terms of the provision of defense and security equipment. And that slide 2, chart 2, also just relates to the sales of defense capabilities, not security capabilities. And that data was drawn from UK government sources. Could we go to the next slide, please? So the UK has developed over a long period of time some fairly sophisticated export control principles. And they are, I would suggest, very akin to the same approaches that the US Department of Defense and Department of State take in terms of their handling of export controls as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the UK has had a long history of working in the international environment, and it really goes back to the 1960s, actually, when the UK and France embarked on a fighter aircraft program, an Anglo-French program, known then as Jaguar. That for both governments, I think, was the first opportunity for them to cut their teeth in this particular domain. But the UK has continued to better its understanding of export controls and also more widely in the context of international trade and handling international businesses on a progressive basis ever since. If I just continue to focus on fighter aircraft themselves, of course, we moved from the Jaguar program in the 1960s, working with the French, to the Tornado program in the 1970s and 80s, where we worked with the German and Italian governments. And then in the 90s, we moved to the Typhoon program, which involved Germany, Italy, and then Spain. And of course, more recently, the UK is a level 1 partner in the F-35 program. So our knowledge, our expertise has evolved progressively during several decades. And I'm fairly confident that the UK government has a very clear expose of what it requires in terms of export controls. There are links in the slides that I provided. If you get the hard copies, you'll be able to access those links. But in principle, there are 3 sort of steps to engagement, if you like, before a sale or a transfer of item can actually be concluded. We also require that before any contracts, there is a clear understanding that the contract could be executed. The last thing anyone wants to do in a commercial setting internationally is to tee up a contract where there is a failure to deliver or a risk that something may not be able to be delivered because of an export control constraint that was not addressed. So those export control issues are addressed very, very early. And so much so that there is a process in the UK called the Form 680 process, which is similar to a DSP-5 process in the United States, that requires permission to even market or have initial conversations about those capabilities with a foreign country, whether it be a buying partner or a collaborative partner. So that process is well understood and well documented and well adhered to, I have to say. So those steps also require, of course, complete transparency of approach, not just across government, but also with industry partners, and also to make sure that we are able to share the appropriate classified information, and that we're also able to understand whether or not any items or components would need to be exported from beyond the shores of the United Kingdom, i.e. where a third-party nation may be contributing to the capability that is in question. Maybe move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just to reinforce the fact that the UK government is very proactive and very engaged in the international marketplace. And it does this, of course, by being involved in a very broad range of multilateral organizations. And more importantly, from an industrial perspective, it also provides a very joined up focus in terms of a government position in terms of handling export controls. So there is a relatively new organization called the Export Control Joint Unit, and that is responsible for administrating the whole of the UK's system of export controls. And it's important that the ECJU operates efficiently. And most importantly, from my perspective or industrialist perspective, is it actually brings together the political, operational, and policy expertise from the Department of International Trade, from the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and of course, from the Ministry of Defense itself. So those 3 departments are very interlinked in any process to underpin any export control business from the United Kingdom. And also, I think, extremely helpfully from a UK perspective and often overlooked, the UK government is able to offer as well UK export finance. And in the slide, I attach a link which would take you to the Export Finance Organization's website, so you can understand how that organization relates to export-related business and how it plays an important part in being able to promote good business from the United Kingdom. May we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, there are a very broad spectrum of international protocols and norms that relate to export controls. Every nation has, to a degree, its own specific policies, but they are largely predicated on pre-existing international agreements, many of which have been in place for some considerable time. And I just pull out 5 in the first sub-bullet that are probably the most prominent ones, and how they dictate the way that most nations in the Western world actually behave and respond to export control related issues in the international marketplace. I should say that these regimes do not necessarily have universal membership. Membership does vary across those individual groupings, but they do have many adherents, and the ones that are the adherents are the ones that would be the most trusted and reliable collaborative partners, and probably the most reliable partners as well in terms of export sales. I should add that some countries can potentially be embargoed or restricted at particular points in time, and that may complicate issues. And on some occasions, some companies and some countries may actually take different views about specific markets. And I think that is important as well to keep a handle on. In terms of the last bullet, this is just a sort of flag, if you like, that there are some really significant new challenges on the horizon as well. Most of the regimes and protocols that currently exist would not be as elegant right now in terms of handling some new capabilities, particularly around issues like artificial intelligence, where there are some particular constraints and perceptions that would need to be really understood before we were in a position to really think about militarizing and exporting some of those capabilities. But there are others too that are not just on the horizon, perhaps now coming more into operational focus. A lot of attention on laser-directed energy weapons, but also on space-based systems. And I could go on adding other items to that list. For instance, hypersonic missiles as well, which are of great concern to a number of Western nations. So whilst protocols and norms exist, we should not be complacent, as many systems, capabilities, and technologies will inevitably over time challenge some of those protocols and some of those norms. Could we go to the next slide, please? Another point I think is extremely topical at the moment is making sure that export control obligations are just not the responsibility of the prime contractor or the government involved, but they do require a full understanding and a level of responsibility throughout the whole of the supply chain. And if I just reflected on my experience of working on the Typhoon supply chain, that is extremely wide and deep and transnational. So it's an international supply chain. And that brings with it the need to make sure that prime contractors have flowed down all the obligations that suppliers need to understand. And in doing so, of course, the end use or end users of those items must be clearly understood by all parties to avoid any uncertainties or any disconnects post-contract award that could be extremely damaging and extremely costly for all parties involved. I should add also that increasingly people need to be aware of the application or use of dual use items. I said on my slide, they can add complication. The sorts of example I had in mind is in the supply chain, you may have companies that are supplying basic products, both to the civil aerospace sector and also to the defense sector. Those companies need to know whether or not their particular products are going to be subject to defense export controls or simply to be part of the civil supply chain. So a wary eye needs to be paid to dual use items. Risks can also emerge when companies in the supply chain are purchased by others. And I guess we have probably, if you've been reading the media, 2 current examples in the UK where Ultra is potentially going to be acquired by Cobham, and also Megit, which is under bid from possibly two potential bidders, both the United States in origin. And this has caused the UK government to, at least in the latter case, to evaluate how that might impact upon the UK's domestic capabilities and what it might mean in terms of the future for certain capabilities and products that might have been sold by the United Kingdom overseas, or indeed to participate in the future in collaborative programs. I should say that this is nothing new. And if I looked at the UK, of course, a part of the defence infrastructure, industrial infrastructure in the UK, is owned and operated by other nations. We have Lockheed Martin, resident in the United Kingdom. We have Northrop Grumman. We have Raytheon, General Dynamics. But we also have Thales UK, Leonardo, and other companies as well. And indeed, we have some significant businesses in the UK that are involved in international markets. And I could pick BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, who have very significant footprints in the United States. These are not necessarily impediments to doing business, and in fact, often need to be encouraged. But they also need to be factored in to the decision-making and to make sure that the right approvals are solicited at the right time to enable exports to be made, or for international collaborative opportunities to be developed and be productive. Maybe go to the next slide, please. Just reflecting very briefly, because I did spend quite a lot of time in and around the United States. I also worked for the United States Navy for a period of time much earlier in my career. So I'm very used to working internationally with the US. And I think I just want to make the point here that, yes, the US has incredibly sophisticated export control procedures, and it is absolutely right that the US should do that. The US probably at the moment has still a very significant lead in terms of its defense industrial and technological base, and it is very right that the US should do everything within its powers to protect that. And I think it's very evident that if you actually look at the the Department of State website that deals with infringements on export controls or variations from what was intended, there's some very stiff penalties there, and there's some very interesting organizations that over time have become embroiled in some discrepancies in terms of export controls. And I think it's well worth reflecting on the nature of those infringements and the type of companies that were involved. It's not all overseas companies. A lot of American companies themselves have fallen foul of arms export control regulations. And there were also some individuals and smaller groups that have possibly conspired against the US to actually be able to extract technology for ulterior motives. The penalties for those things are extremely severe. And I, as an individual in the UK, was always very cognizant of how that regime operated. And I held it as a sort of gold standard in terms of how the UK also needed to be able to do its own business. Maybe go to the next slide, please. So from what I've heard from the previous presentation and what I think possibly will come up in discussion, I'd just like to offer some thoughts. I mean, export control is clearly a vital government and industry function, but it's not just a function in a security sense, it's also a function in a commercial sense. For countries like the United Kingdom, we need to be able to export and we need to be able to collaborate to have a strong and healthy and vibrant defense, industrial and technological base ourselves. So export controls clearly a very, very vital element of that business process. Ensuring compliance also needs, from my experience, to be built around a team of multi-skilled staff. I don't think there's any such thing as an export control expert. People may think they are, but they also need suitably qualified and experienced personnel to provide technical, operational, security, and other military perspectives to make sure that any decision-making around export controls is the best decision that can be taken at any particular time. Because everyone, government and industry, wants to avoid any risk of reputational damage, any sanctions or any embargoes. Those can be disastrous. And I would also point out that even looking at the UK system and the US system, and what I understand of Japan's system, there is no perfect system. New technologies and new capabilities will always be testing those existing frameworks. So don't look at anyone's national system and think that is an off-the-shelf solution to a domestic problem. It isn't. It's a solution that fits that nation's security needs at that time. But they must evolve, and they must be dynamic, and they must be kept under review. And I think from reflecting in terms of the depth and the breadth of experience that the UK has had of working internationally, both as a collaborative partner and also in the international sales market, the best systems evolve over time, and the best systems are developed by working with like-minded nations and with like-minded countries. And from that, the best can certainly be developed and understood. And my final slide, I think, if we could go to that one. Just some potential points from discussion, for discussion from my perspective. I think it's really clear that we need to understand what a trusted environment actually looks like and how we can share classified information efficiently and effectively without fear of any of those protective measures being breached. We also need to have an effective means, I think, in Japan for the promotion of JSDF capabilities. Japanese self-defense forces have some very sophisticated and elegant solutions for the international marketplace. But creating those international relationships between domestic companies and also international partners is one that takes time to build. It does not necessarily happen overnight. And those relationships need to be encouraged and need to be given the opportunity to flourish and to grow. And I think also it's always good to continue to think outside the box and not be satisfied with the processes that currently exist, but also to be actively thinking about other potential concerns that may impact upon export controls and international trade into the future, and to remain agile to be able to respond to those. That was my final slide, and that ends my remarks. Thank you very much for your attention.
アンドリュー・ラドクリフさん、どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you, Andrew Radcliffe. We have heard from his broad knowledge and rich experience, a very interesting discussion, I believe. I was nodding in some cases, having questions in other cases, and I would think that a proof of that is the large number of questions that have come in from our listeners. I would like to say two things. Please do not submit your questions through the chat box. Please use only the Q&A utility. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that the speakers who have participated in this have been looking at the Q&A questions, and I would like to have them have time to prepare their answers for that. So I would now like to move to our last presenter, who is Mr. Ida from the Ministry of Economy and Trade.
Thank you very much. I'm Yoichi Ida from METI. Thank you so much for this invitation to participate in an ISIC seminar. It's an honor for me to be alongside Mr. Kasagahara and Mr. Radcliffe, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session with the many participants. Starting in the early 90s, export controls for dual use and military items is something that I started working on at EMI. So I have that experience, but as has already been mentioned, for actual export of items, our national security strategy and the 3 principles for export controls, the guidelines, defense guidelines were updated. And so it's only in around 2012 or so that we started to have a big shift in our government policy for the last 7 to 8 years. This legal framework is being clarified, and based on that, and also in light of the changes in our security environment in Japan, we have been doing defense cooperation, but not just for the defense industry, but irreversible movements have started in industry broadly, I believe. Myself, since 2012 in METI, I've been looking at space and aircraft. I was head of the unit responsible for exit recalls, and I have also been in other positions related to export controls. And so for about 10 years, I have been directly involved in creating policy in this area. And I have been looking at the situation surrounding us. And so it's from that perspective that I am joining today's discussion. This is a public webinar, of course, completely public, so I'll be cautious in my comments. So, first of all, our topic today is export controls for weapons. An advantage of being the third speaker is that I was able to listen to Mr. Kasagahara and Mr. Radcliffe. And so we don't have to have a closed discussion of restrictions or regulations, but it's been said that we should look at this more broadly. Mr. Kasagahara talked about he gave a comprehensive overview of the situation and issues for Japan. And it's in the title, but he said it was in one of his titles that he was making efforts to meet these challenges. And technology cooperation is one of the Japanese government's policy items. What is the purpose? What kind of under which conditions will we give what to whom? All of these items have to be considered in making decisions. Of course, this is about cooperation. So allies and partners will discuss the content of security considerations. And equipment transfer is only one method of defense cooperation. And that kind of broader security cooperation is indispensable in order for the equipment transfer to happen. So how are we actually doing this? Now, as was mentioned, and as I've been trying to say, when we decide what it is that we're going to transfer, will it be an effective means for the partner country? Will it be parts? Will it be a finished system? Is it going to be services, operational training, upgrading? As to what it is going to be, it's not just the two governments that should be involved. Private industry should also be involved in the discussion as to what exactly should be transferred in identifying candidates for transfer. The three principles were revised in 2014 for transfer of defense equipment. It's been pointed out that not much progress has been seen since. That may be true. However, the government of Japan, especially ATLA, as Mr. Kasugahara mentioned, has been creating legal frameworks such as agreements, but not just that. They have been talking to industry. They have been participating in international defense expositions. They have been holding forums to host the defense industry. And the government of Japan is taking very important steps forward, I believe. However, Mr. Radcliffe mentioned at the outset that since the 1980s, the arms export trends in the UK were highlighted by him. Now, we think that this might be important and suggestive for Japan. Mr. Radcliffe talked about what kind of involvement the UK government has had, including regulation. In May, Mr. Taylor from Lucy talked about the support that the UK government gives to industry. So these two, both export controls and support for industry, I think are both important when we think about exporting defense items. As to the relationship between government and industry, it's not just a matter of regulation, but as Professor Taniguchi said at the outset, we also have to think about it from the perspective of promoting industry. Also, Mr. Radcliffe talked about emerging technology and the supply chain today. And this is something for which we have to focus on critical technology as a whole and not too narrowly focus on military technology. Corporations that have this, research and development institutions, universities also have to, we have to consider their perspectives as well. The government can reach out to them, can intervene in what they're doing, can interfere with what they are doing. Mr. Regliff talked about confidentiality and maintaining secrecy. And there's also the question of investment control. There are all kinds of policy tools, industry promotion, industry regulation. The point is that the government as a whole has to have comprehensive policy to approach this tough question of export of arms. Economic security is what I'm working on now. And I think that this is a very tough question. It's not an easy question, even for the UK to deal with, I don't believe. I think that the Japanese government and industry have a long way to go. But myself, looking at the UK and the US, our friends, our ally, I think we should be in touch as we try to tackle these various challenges. It's gone on quite a long time, but I share the perspectives that Mr. Kasagahara and Mr. Regliff shared. I do have a few points that I think I need to look at further. Arms export, first of all, the government has to be very much involved, and it has to be done within the framework of security cooperation. Otherwise, it won't happen. No. In Japan, domestically, it might said to be not appropriate, but competitiveness and the defense industry also need to be thought of together. Competitiveness affects functionality, quality, cost, delivery, operational support, other services. Competitiveness comes from all of those factors. These factors are not peculiar to the defense industry. It's the same for private industry. I think you would all agree. However, in the case of military equipment, especially when it comes to sensitive technology, there is a requirement to keep secrets. So if we say that the market is small, or that we can't move overseas, we can't let a lack of preparation stand in the way. We have to be prepared in all those areas. Otherwise, it might be difficult to survive. Unfortunately, we've seen companies leaving the defense industry market. And I think that might be a result of this kind of lack of preparation. It's not as if our defense industry is ending, but if you consider the examples of the UK, it was mentioned that there was cooperation with foreign industry. Ships, aircraft, missiles, vehicles, we have to have a full set and maintain them and develop them. But I think we have to say that it's very tough for any firm to do all of that. So Japanese companies can focus on what they're good at, or what they might have good potential to develop. and not be limited to precedent, and to develop equipment that Japan needs, develop it, procure it, deploy it, make it operational. I think that's the kind of relationship we ought to have with our defense industry. And within that, if there is competitiveness, then we can be active overseas, and then that international activity will then benefit our domestic activity. In the UK, I think that is the kind of cycle that the policy package has been encouraging. So if we could go back one slide, or forward one slide rather. So if you look at this slide, defense industry cooperation, defense equipment export. When we think about these problems, I think it's useful to separate the issues into various layers. At the top, you see platforms and systems for finished items. And this will mostly be discussed in the context of national security. JMOD and ATLA will take the lead with the cooperation of industry to think about the needs of partner countries. Mr. Kasagahara said that it's important to make further progress in this area, and we have great expectations here. If it's an emerging market, then it wouldn't be just JMOD, but the entire government of Japan would have to be involved, including on the aspect of finance. When it comes to subsystems, parts, materials, components, as Mr. Kasagahara mentioned, there have been instances such as the F-100 engines, and they have to not only meet the criteria of the three principles, but also the regulations of the partner country. And we are hoping that our industry and government will get further experience here. The third point I should like to emphasize also has to do with economic security, and it's dual use materials, emerging technologies. We should think of it as the same way as the defense industry, protect it and promote it. It goes without saying that in this area, civil and defense technologies blend. However, classic defense controls that try to prevent proliferation would not be appropriate here. But this could be a factor that greatly influences Japan's security. And so we have to promote these industries and protect them and try to achieve superiority vis-a-vis other countries, and decide as a government to which countries these technologies can be released. And we're not there yet. We have more work to do in terms of creating such a system. If you look at Japan overall, JMOD, METI, other related industries, we can look at the areas where Japanese industry is strong, and I think that we would all agree that it's necessary to strengthen all of the layers that we see on this slide. Next slide, please. You can see where METI is looking at dual use and emerging technologies. Here are some examples. there's already a public-private cooperation that is strengthening from the perspective of economic security on these examples. So with those details, I shall close my presentation. I'm afraid I talked about a lot of issues, and I'm looking for solutions, and I am looking forward to your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ida-san, very much. We have an audience of almost 200 people who have listened today. We appreciate that very much. I want to say just one thing to that audience. Ida-san and Kasugahara-san, the ATLA and METI representatives talking about promotion and protection. These are the top people in these fields for military equipment. For me, it is really something that gives me confidence, makes me want to feel confident that we were able to attract these two individuals. I have just begun, so my work is from now on, but I want to share with the audience my motivation that I received from that. We have received many questions from the audience. I think that our three speakers can see them. I would say rather than questions from the floor, I would say from your standpoint, what did you think, Andrew Radcliffe, as you listened to the two Japanese speakers? If you could just say a word about your impressions, that would be helpful.
Of course, very happy to do that. I think, as you said, you have two experts in the field dealing with these subjects, which gives a high degree of confidence that the right issues are being examined and looked at. I think from my perspective, no longer in the British government, so cannot speak from the British government, of course, but international dialogue to make sure that any concerns that may exist in METI or in ATLA or JMOD, always best to share those concerns in order to get the experience of others that have possibly been on that journey previously. I know the UK and the US would be more than happy to share any experiences, and presumably they already are. So I think you're creating a pathway for Japan, which is very positive. I think as I said in my presentation, I think don't be embarrassed or feel awkward about having that engagement with people that will be very willing to share their experiences and their ideas. There's nothing to be gained by falling into a trap that someone else has already fallen into.
ありがとうございます。こういうのを日本語では、ケンケン福井。
Thank you very much. I will take this very seriously, your comments, and I want to incorporate that into my future thinking. We have had questions from a number of individuals about FMS. Why does Japan not have an FMS system? I think this question probably comes up a lot. What do you think, Kasugahara-san?
It would be great, I think, personally, if we could have FMS. But we're still not there. The government would be the point of contact. The government would provide the equipment. In order to get there, certainly we'd have to clear the budgetary restrictions and also the technical restrictions. There are problems of size, capacity, our capacity to handle such work. Honestly, we're not there yet. So there's just a physical limitation. There are probably legal restrictions too. So we're just not there. Can't take that decisive steps. I think that the various issues stand in the way. We are making slow progress. It's a rather Japanese way of proceeding. We are considering the situations of our partners and trying to move in the right direction. I'm not sure if that's much of an answer. Perhaps Mr. Ida or Mr. Ragland have suggestions for me.
How about you, Ida-san?
This has to do with what I was saying earlier. But in the background of that, we have to have a strong security cooperation in place. How much trust do we have with our partner? I think that's a basic question. As Mr. Kazak said, we have to invest a lot of resources, and that would cause some things to see their cost go up. So to make it worthwhile, quality, cost, delivery, service would have to be worth it. And I think that would make it possible to have FMS. So it depends on not just the government's ability, but also on the competitiveness of industry, I think. Another way of looking at it is that we could try to think about what kinds of items would merit FMS. I think that might be the best way to get this discussion started, is identify.
There aren't that many examples yet in which these cases have come together, and at the same time, we haven't got a regime established yet to do it. There has to be a big push, I feel, still. Is that a correct understanding, that we still are lacking a big push to make this happen?
That's exactly right.
Thank you. This is a question for Kasugahara-san with your name. Maybe somewhat related or similar, which is why isn't this handled in a set with financing?
That's a wonderfully well pinpointed question. For developing countries, when we think about cooperation, funding always comes up as being very important. So it's just as the questioner points out, various financial institutions exist within the government. And it's not a matter of just lending money, but there are other tools that could support such transactions financially for developing countries. So I think that's a good suggestion.
In terms of the FMS issue that we were talking about, there's someone's pointing out that that's already behind the times, that's already out of date. More than that, we should have direct commercial sales, DCS would be preferable. Such an opinion has been expressed. I would like to ask your ideas about that, Mr. Andrew Radcliffe.
Yes, on the subject of foreign military sales, again, I'm not speaking for the British government, but that has been evaluated several times in the UK to see if it was a viable option. And to the best of my knowledge, every time it's been reviewed, that is not being taken forward as a viable solution for the UK. One of the key reasons is that the US has the benefits of a potentially huge scale in its programs. So for programs like F-16, F-15, F-18, it's very easy to go down that FMS route and be a client, be a customer, and be at the back end of that program. If I looked at UK programs that are a similar ilk, and I looked at Tornado or Typhoon, they were collaborative ventures, not the same. Now, of course, the UK clearly benefits from the US FMS system in a way, and particularly F-35 is the classic example where it does do that. But I think from a political and policy perspective in the UK, and again, I repeat, I'm not speaking for the British government, we don't think that it is a viable approach, largely based on economies of scale and being able to also take the financial risk of that as well. Collaboration has been more and more of a model for us, and direct commercial sales.
はい、ありがとうございました。何件か国際的
Thank you very much. There have been several sharp questions regarding international cooperations or comparisons. One is saying that Korea has done very well. What about another is pointing out the example of the submarine case in Australia, the missed opportunity. A very sharp question has been posed on this line. Another person, David Iwata, posed that question. Another asks whether the U.S. is regarding Japan as a cooperator or as, in fact, a competitor in the export of military equipment. I'd like to ask Kasugahara-san, Ida-san.
の事例についてご紹介があったわけですけれども、やはりそれ
Well,
は
so the case of Korea was mentioned. So looking at South Korea, they cooperated with Lockheed Martin. So policy for arms exports between Korea and the United States, I think there was policy cooperation. In the case of Japan, how will we export to a variety of countries? Will we be able to have good coordination? I think one of the reasons for their success was a good policy coordination bilaterally between South Korea and the United States. So it comes to whether you're able to engage in that policy coordination or not, I believe.
Do you have anything to add to that, Kasugahara-san?
On the Australian submarine case, that's to my predecessor, I think, that was responsible for that. But not just for that case, but for the contribution to the local community. And this was not just for the Australia case, but aside from the military item itself, there are other considerations that come into play and that are very tough to deal with. This also comes into play for developing countries. What are the advantages for the host country? We have to think about all of these factors. We have to take a broad point of view, and we have to understand the situation of the local area to which these items will be provided. We have progress to make here, and I think we learned lessons in that area. With respect to our relations with the United States of America, as was said earlier, we have a lot of cooperation with the U.S., including cooperative R&D. If they are cautious of us as a competitor, then that would be great. That means we would be competitive. I don't think that we're at the point that they would consider us a competitive threat, though. But we do think that some of what we have to offer is of good quality, and we do have good cooperative relations. But we can't put everything in the same category. We each have our own strengths, and we can be competing and cooperating in various fields. I think that's normal among any group of partners or allies. So I think we can manage all of those things as we go about with cooperating with a lot of different
Thank you.
countries.
I'm very sorry to say it, but we have reached our time. We have in 5 minutes, we are out of time. So I would like to talk from the standpoint of the MC. I have left my job a bit unfinished, but among the questions that have come to the three speakers, there are some that I would like to pick out. So Radcliffe-san, Ida-san, Kasugara-san, in that order, I will pick one question from the Q&A for each of you and ask you to respond briefly, and thereon finish the session. Thank you.
There is a question on artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapon systems that are not in the MTCR, the WASNR, or the AG. The same for hypersonics. And I think that is a very, could describe it as a real and present danger, that there are no protocols right now that are dealing with those issues. So whilst it's important that we continue to learn lessons from the past that has just been articulated and think about how we evolved and deal with these scenarios in the future, these are some real significant challenges, I think, that confront all of us, not just the UK and Japan, but also the United States as well. And I think an early consensus is possible on how to deal with some of those systems and some of those technologies is going to be a huge challenge for all of us to address in the coming months, not years, but in the coming months, because some of those capabilities, some of those technologies are a very real and present danger today, and we need to have responses to those, and we need to know how to deal with them as well from a domestic and an international perspective. It's a great question.
ありがとうございました。じゃあ、飯田さん、短くお願いします。
Thank you. Then briefly, Mr. Ida, could you respond to a question?
Very well. So is it possible to have consolidation in Japan as happened in the United States? I think Iwata-san asked that question. So looking at Japan's defense industry and the position that defense divisions have in Japanese corporation is different than in the United States. But personally, looking at the possibility of consolidation, if there are a possibility to do so, I think that would possibly be good for Japan. Would it be appropriate or not? Lots of people have different views, I'm sure. In international cooperation, foreign companies can create conglomerates. I think there are lots of different possibilities or coalitions, consortiums. Of course, there would have to be appropriate controls placed on any such investment. But if we can harness Japan's strengths and improve our competitiveness to see SDF equipment developed, if there's a need to change the industrial structure to make that happen, then I would be for it.
Thank you. This is now really the end. Kasugara-san, please.
Very good. There was an early question about the seeds list. So dual use civilian technology is progressing rapidly. So we have to look at various seeds to think about different ways of fighting. AI is also a consideration. The situation is changing, and we need to understand how to deal with gray zone situations, new ways of fighting, and be able to distinguish seeds. And we have to enhance our capability of doing so. I think that was a very important question. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for today.
thank you everyone for your participation today. From my part, I want to thank and express my deep appreciation to the three speakers today and to our good interpreters today, our two interpreters, and to all of the technical support personnel involved in putting on this webinar. Thank you very much. A large number of people participated. That was very impressive to me. We still have, we had at one point more than 200 individuals participating. So I think that you can see the strong interest, and the questions that came in were all very specialized, expert. That also impressed me very much. I would like to keep trying working on further such efforts in the future, and to be able to work with the people on the front lines, Kasagara-san, Ida-san, Radcliffe-san, to pull forward the Japanese defense industry is something which I deeply appreciate the opportunity to participate in. Thank you very much, and goodbye to all.
Thank you very much.